Hi, guys. Part two on a little bit of background with this book in relation to the whole of young adult fiction. There's a great irony here, I think, in that when we think about The Catcher in the Rye, it's really the first realistic book for and about a teenager. Um, what do I mean by that? Well, Holden Caulfield, who is our protagonist, as you're going to see, is not just happy go lucky, Johnny football ace whose only worry is, am I going to have a date for the prom? Um, Instead, he's deeply troubled. Um, in fact, you could say that he's a little bit out there uh, compared to most teenagers. But what is realistic about him is that he does have things that he's depressed about. He does have things that are weighing heavily on him. He isn't doing great in school. He's not a straight A student. We see other things like, he curses and he even smokes and drinks. Um, he uh, he seems a lot more real than all those kids and all those other books that had come before that were perfect in every way. Holden Caulfield is far from perfect, and he's got a very deep interior life. He thinks about things, he worries about things, um, he has problems. So, what's the irony there? Well, the irony is we have this book with this very realistic 16-year-old protagonist, probably my estimation, the first real young adult novel. Um, but teenagers were not allowed to read it at the time. Now you have to think about this book came out in 1951. That's the middle of the 20th century. That's a long time ago. Um, Things back then were very staid, very conservative. And people thought this book was not appropriate for kids to be reading. Now, when I say people, I mean parents, I mean teachers, I mean librarians, so on, right? So almost anybody at the time who was in a position to put a book into a kid's hand said no to this book. They just thought that, with all the swearing and the drinking and the smoking, there's even a little bit of sex in this book, that it just was not appropriate for kids, right? Um, so uh, that's reason one that they didn't allow the kids to read it. This book was challenged quite a bit, it was banned quite a bit. Um, It also, though, and here's reason two, reason two why kids didn't read it. This book was sort of an overnight, immediate literary success. Why? Because adults read it. Adults immediately recognized that this was a great work of literature, which it was, and it still is. Um, but the thinking was, well, if it's a great work of literature, it can't be written for kids, right? The only books we have that are written for kids are silly little throwaways about football quarterbacks and cheerleaders and the prom. Those books are silly. Those books are nonsense. So if this is a serious work of literature, clearly it's not meant for kids. Well, that thinking was wrong, of course, right? A book can be written for kids, for teenagers, and also be a great work of art, a great work of literature, and this, in fact, is. But for those two reasons, at the time, kids were not allowed to read this book, even though, again, as I argue, it was the first real and realistic young adult novel. All right. So, two reasons. One, not appropriate for kids. Too much swearing, too much drinking, too much smoking, too much, of this kid being wise and worldly, right? Not fresh and innocent. And number two, well, it can't possibly be a kid's book if it's a great work of literature. Well, those were wrong. Both those were wrong. So it was not until 20 plus years later, I would say, probably, a couple of decades before they started assigning this book in high schools and they started saying, yes, this is a book for young adults. But that's a long time, 20 years. So for 20 years, for 2 decades plus, they were not allowing kids to see or read this book. So we're going to approach it as what it is. It's a young adult novel. It has a young adult protagonist. It has young adult concerns. And on the other hand, it's a great work of art. It's beautifully written. It's funny. Holden is a deeply sympathetic character. And this book has become kind of a timeless classic. All right, so think about those things and we'll get started reading and we'll move forward.